Perhaps you didn't know it, but the war in Ukraine wasn't actually started by Vladimir Putin, but by the West. At least that's the narrative being spied by Russian TV to justify the invasion.
Я хочу это повторить. Это они развязали войну. А мы использовали силу и используем, чтобы ее остановить.
Нарастающие санкции, военная экспансия НАТО в нашу сторону, отказ от переговоров по безопасности и откровенная подготовка к военному уничтожению России.
Конец в смысле Российской Федерации, расчленение, уничтожение.
That's right. In Russia, they figured out your cunning plan. Hi everyone, my name is Valeria Ratnikova. I'm a journalist for the Russian independent channel TV Rain. And today I'm going to tell you all about how Kremlin propaganda blames all its troubles on the West. Western countries have a long-standing dream of destroying Russia, and according to propaganda, in order to make this dream a reality, they need to get closer.
Не российские войска сегодня находятся у ворот Америки. Не мы там, а Америка находится у нас на пороге.
Vladimir Putin and then propaganda after him assure us Russia is surrounded by hostile NATO bases. Year after year, the military alliance expands eastward.
Ни одного дюйма на восток, сказали нам в 90-е годы. Ну и чего? Надули.
Vladimir Putin repeated this statement once again in December 2021, when he had already sent tens of thousands of troops to the border with Ukraine. At the same time, he neglected to mention that neither Russia nor the USSR had ever received written guarantees from Western countries regarding a lack of eastward expansion.
Просто нагло обманули. 5 волн расширения НАТО.
Time for a quick recap. On the eve of his first presidential term, Putin didn't even rule out Russia itself joining NATO. He insisted that it was necessary to cooperate with the alliance. Also, the state of Eastern Europe bordering Russia joined NATO long ago and haven't exactly been launching missiles at Moscow. Nevertheless, by now, both the Russian authorities and the propagandists have changed their tune. According to them, the purpose of accepting Eastern European countries into NATO is to lay siege to Russia, and now the reach of the enemy West has made it to Ukraine. To the bright stars of Russian television, Ukraine has long been turned against the Russians with the help of cookies. In 2014, the Maidan revolution took place, in which the Ukrainians took to the streets and forced a change in government. Democratic protest seemed to overwhelm the propaganda machine, so they came up with a bizarre explanation. It all had to do with the cookies that Victoria Nuland, an American State Department official, handed out to the protesters in Kiev.
А чего все началось? А всего началось с печенья госпожи Нуланд. Печеньки госпожи Нуланд развалят любую страну, любую государственность. И она несет полную ответственность за то, что происходит.
Он украинцев кормила Нуланд плюшечками этими, печенками. Видите, чем закончилось? Страну потеряли из-за этих печенок. Думать головой надо.
The viewers of state television are told that people in Ukraine wouldn't have protested without Nuland cookies. In fact, Ukrainians were first inspired to take to the streets by President Yanukovych's sudden refusal to sign the association agreement with the European Union. The protests were then forcefully broken up and targeted by the passing of new repressing laws, which only made the demonstrations even larger. These events led to a change of power in Ukraine, and President Yanukovych fleeing to Russia.
Они организовали события 2014 года ровно для того, чтобы Украина не ушла с этих рельсов, чтобы она все-таки стала проектом антироссия.
Project Anti-Russia is a term coined by Vladimir Putin, then picked up by officials and TV anchors. It's as if someone, and you might have guessed who, had been systematically molding Ukraine into an enemy of all things Russian. But here's what really happened. Shortly after the success of the Maidan uprising in Ukraine, Vladimir Putin annexed the peninsula of Crimea, an internationally recognized territory of Ukraine, even by Russia. In 2008, Putin himself said that Crimea was Ukrainian.
Крым не является никакой спорной территорией. И Россия давно признала границы сегодняшней Украины.
As a result, after the annexation of Crimea, Putin started a war in eastern Ukraine, relying on long-standing separatist sentiments in the region. It has been proven that Russia supplied weapons and sent troops to Donbass. Bellingcat, Atlantic Council, the BBC and others have published investigations on the subject, and the court at The Hague confirmed that arms deliveries did take place. Since then, the war has essentially never stopped. But on February 24, 2022, it took the form of a full-scale offensive. None of this is mentioned by propaganda, which only talks about the West pumping weapons into Ukraine, waiting for an opportune moment to invade.
8 лет Украина оккупирована Соединенными Штатами Америки. И они системно ведут свои программы по накачиванию Украины и созданию ее как плацдарма для нападения на Российскую Федерацию.
Propagandists would never tell you, however, that the West began to send heavy offensive weapons to Ukraine only a few months after the Russian invasion. Before February 24, 2022, very few lethal weapons had been sent to Ukraine.
Иметь у себя под боком такую страну, извините меня, да еще которой руководит не сам руководитель страны, а им руководят откуда-то далеко за 1000 километров, это предельно опасно.
The logic of the propagandists is that Vladimir Putin was simply left with no choice but to launch a preemptive strike. If the Kremlin hadn't initiated its so-called special military operation, then Russia would have been invaded. No convincing evidence of such plan by Western countries is ever shown on TV. Shortly before the invasion, Russian propagandists even assured everyone that nothing would happen. They'd laugh at the warnings of Western intelligence agencies. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova even complained that she couldn't plan a holiday and asked the Western media to announce the schedule of invasions for the year ahead.
Сегодня мы отмечаем очередной день ненападения на Украину с точки зрения, так сказать, здравого смысла и реальности. И очередной день, который вот-вот приблизит нас к некой войне, которую нам все обещали на Западе, в Вашингтоне, в Лондоне.
Россия начать войну на Украине не собирается. И если Россия будет вынуждена вмешаться в то, что происходит на Украине, то только с целью закончить войну на Украине.
But resisting NATO is only one of the official goals of the so-called special operation. They constantly tell Russians about the problem of Nazism in Ukraine and the persecution of the Russian-speaking population there, which must be protected. But in the end, the collective West is behind it all.
И даже в 90-е, когда отношения были хорошими, Запад, напомнил Путин, спонсировал террористов, чтобы подорвать Россию.
Тогда у них это не вышло. Не выйдет и сейчас.
In his 23 years in power, Putin has shown no evidence that the West sponsored terrorists in the Caucasus. But now he and propaganda after him use those examples as a way to present the war with Ukraine as an existential battle between Russia and the West. Now it no longer becomes a story just about fighting on the ground, but a question of morality. For a year, Russia has been at war with Satanists.
Россия больше не сосредотачивается, Россия уже сердится. Они свой конец найдут. С нами вышла воевать сатана. Это его последний, может быть, решительный бой против огромной православной цивилизации.
Против нас весь западный мир. И это действительно война за выживание. Кто кого? Они нас или мы их. Украинцы, конечно, уже давным-давно к этому не имеют, при всем уважении к украинцам, вообще никакого отношения. Просто вот эта территория выбрана как место боестолкновения. Они жертвы в том числе. Побочный эффект. Как бы жутко это ни звучало, но...
Вашингтон сделал Украину пушечным мясом для решения своих вопросов.
1 year into the war, propagandists now explain Ukraine was actually defeated long ago and now the Russian army is confronting the entire NATO bloc. It begs the question, why then would Western countries not send their own troops to Ukraine? In fact, hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are fighting in the Ukrainian armed forces. The Russian army has already had to abandon several occupied territories. First the Kiev region, then the Kharkiv region, then the only captured regional center, the city of Kherson. It doesn't look like Ukraine has been defeated.
Давайте будем объективны. Специальная военная операция против Украины закончилась давно. То есть весь военно-промышленный потенциал Украины уничтожен уже ощутимо давно.
Да мы воюем с Западом.
Мы сейчас воюем с Западом, мы воюем с натовским оружием, мы воюем против натовского оружия, мы воюем против натовского ВПК.
But Russian propagandists haven't lost their sense of optimism, at least outwardly. The West will also be defeated, there is no other option. After all, if anything goes wrong, every single citizen will be sent to The Hague, according to the scaremongering of Margarita Simonyan.
Если мы умудримся проиграть, Гаага, условная или конкретная, ждет даже дворника, который брусчатку внутри за кремлевской стеной подметает.
She doesn't mention that the Hague International Court of Justice has never prosecuted inhabitants of aggressor countries simply on the basis of their nationality. But for propaganda, it is important to unite the entire population around the brutal war, and that includes making all Russians feel responsible and making everyone fear retribution. For the West, on the other hand, there is only one message: fear the red button.
Поставляют они, ублюдки, эти вооружения. Ну, конечно, просто разрывает. Удар по центру принятия кокаина. Обязательно должен быть.
Берлин, Париж, Лондон, Брюссель готовы гореть от ударов наших ракет? А если понадобится от использования тактического ядерного оружия?
That's it from me. I hope that now you understand who's really to blame for everything. Let me know who it is in the comments. I've been Valeria Ratnikova, and see you next time.